December 30th, 1610, 4 a.m. Count György Thurzo, Palatine of Hungary, and the king's highest-ranking judicial officer, led a contingent of soldiers through the snow-covered hills toward Csaktice Castle in northwestern Hungary. They'd received reports of screaming from the castle for months, complaints from local families whose daughters had entered the countess's service and never returned, whispers from servants who'd fled in terror. King Matthias II had ordered Thurzo to investigate his own cousin, Countess Elizabeth Bathory, one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in the Kingdom of Hungary. The soldiers entered through the main gate without resistance. The castle was eerily silent. Thurzo climbed the stone stairs to the upper chambers, following a smell that grew stronger with each step: decay, blood, human waste. He pushed open a heavy wooden door. What he found would become the most notorious crime scene in European history. A young girl, no more than 15, lay on the floor, her body covered in burns and cuts, still breathing but unable to speak. Another girl was chained to a wooden post, her hands and feet pierced with needles, blood pooling beneath her. In the courtyard below, investigators found more bodies, some freshly dead, others in advanced decomposition, hidden in storage rooms and beneath floorboards. Over the next days, Thurzo's men excavated the castle and surrounding grounds. They found bodies buried in the courtyard, hidden in the walls, dumped in the river below the castle. They interviewed over 300 witnesses, servants, villagers, survivors, who testified to a decade of systematic torture and murder. The Countess's own servants confessed under interrogation to assisting in the deaths of dozens of young women. One servant claimed to have seen a registry book kept by the Countess herself, listing the names of 650 victims. The book was never found, but the testimonies were consistent and horrifying. Elizabeth Bathory, one of the most educated and powerful noblewomen in Europe, had been torturing and killing young women in her castle for years. The question wasn't just what she'd done. The question was how someone of her status and intelligence had become something so utterly monstrous. Elizabeth Bathory was born August 7, 1560, at the family estate in Nyírbátor, Hungary, into one of the most powerful Protestant noble families in the Kingdom of Hungary. Her family controlled vast territories in Transylvania and Hungary. Her uncle, Stephen Bathory, was King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. Her father was Baron George VI Bathory, her mother, Baroness Anna Bathory. She grew up in castles, educated by private tutors in Latin, Greek, German, and Hungarian, rare for women of her era. She was intelligent, cultured, beautiful, and from childhood, troubled. Elizabeth suffered from severe epileptic seizures beginning at age 4 or 5, accompanied by violent mood swings and migraines. Medical understanding of epilepsy in the 16th century was primitive, and her condition was seen as demonic or supernatural by some. She also witnessed extreme violence from an early age. Servants in noble households were routinely beaten, sometimes to death, with no legal consequences. At age 6, Elizabeth watched a public execution where a man accused of witchcraft was burned alive. The screaming, the smell of burning flesh, the crowd's approval, all of it was normal to her world. Violence wasn't aberrant. It was aristocratic privilege. At age 11, she became engaged to Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a member of another powerful Hungarian noble family. She married him in 1575 at age 15 in one of the most elaborate weddings of the era, attended by 4,000 guests. As a wedding gift, Ferenc gave Elizabeth Csaktice Castle in northwestern Hungary, which would become her primary residence and eventually her prison. Because Elizabeth's family outranked her husband's, she kept the surname Bathory, which Ferenc added to his own. It was an unusual arrangement that signaled Elizabeth's power and status. Ferenc was a soldier, frequently away fighting Ottoman Turks on Hungary's southern borders. He earned the nickname Black Knight of Hungary for his military prowess. Elizabeth managed their vast estates alone for years at a time, wielding absolute authority over hundreds of servants and peasants. She bore 4 children between 1585 and 1595. By all accounts, she was an effective estate manager, educated, capable, and respected by her peers. But rumors began circulating among the servant population about her cruelty. Servants who displeased her were beaten severely. Some disappeared. Ferenc himself was known for extreme cruelty toward servants, once having a servant sewn into the belly of a dying horse for perceived disrespect. Elizabeth participated in and learned from this violence. After Ferenc's death in 1604, Elizabeth, now a widow at 43, had complete control of her estates and no husband to moderate her behavior. This is when the murders appear to have escalated dramatically. She was no longer bound by any authority except the king, and the king was far away, dealing with wars and political intrigue. Elizabeth's victims were initially servants and daughters of local peasants, lured to the castle with promises of employment as maids or ladies-in-waiting. These girls, aged between 10 and 18, came from poor families who saw service in a noble household as an opportunity for their daughters to learn skills, make connections, and perhaps secure better marriages. What happened to these girls inside Choctaw Castle was systematic torture. Witness testimony from Elizabeth's servants, collected during the 1611 trial, described horrific methods of cruelty. Girls were beaten with clubs and whips until they bled. They were burned with red-hot irons, coins, and keys pressed against their faces, breasts, and genitals. They were cut with scissors and knives, their flesh torn from their bodies in strips. They were forced to stand naked in the snow until they froze, then had water poured over them until they died. They were starved, kept in cages too small to stand in, covered in honey, and left for insects to devour. Elizabeth's primary accomplices were 4 of her most trusted servants: Dorothea Zentes, a wet nurse called Dorka, who was in her 50s, Ilona Jo, a servant woman in her 40s, Janos Udvari, called Fichko, a dwarf who served as Elizabeth's manservant, and Katalin Benetsky, an elderly woman who helped procure victims. These 4 assisted in the torture, disposed of bodies, and recruited new victims. They testified during their trial that Elizabeth participated actively in the torture, that she bit victims' faces and breasts, that she stuck needles under their fingernails, that she forced them to eat their own flesh when she had cut it from their bodies. The legend that Elizabeth bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth appears to be exactly that. Legend. This detail first appeared in print in 1729, over a century after her death, in a book by Jesuit scholar Laszlo Turoczi. Witness testimony from 1611 makes no mention of bloodbaths. The testimonies described sadistic violence, torture, and murder, but no ritualistic bathing in blood. That embellishment was added later, transforming Elizabeth from a sadistic killer into a vampiric figure, ultimately earning her the nickname Blood Countess and inspiring comparisons to Vlad the Impaler and Bram Stoker's Dracula. But the reality was worse than the legend. The bloodbaths were sensational fiction. The torture and murder were documented fact. What made Elizabeth escalate from beating servants, which was, horrifyingly, considered within her rights as a noble, to systematic torture and murder? The psychological profile that emerges from the evidence suggests several factors. She had absolute power with no oversight. She had witnessed and participated in extreme violence from childhood. She may have experienced sexual gratification from inflicting pain, though this was never explicitly testified to. She was intelligent and educated enough to understand what she was doing was wrong, but narcissistic enough to believe she was above consequence. And she lived in a society that literally did not value the lives of peasants. Killing a servant might result in a fine paid to the servant's family. Killing a noblewoman was a capital crime. The distinction mattered. Elizabeth's cruelty was initially confined to peasant girls, and for years, no one investigated. Families who complained that their daughters had disappeared after entering the Countess's service were dismissed. Local officials who heard rumors of screaming from the castle chose not to investigate a woman of Elizabeth's rank. The social hierarchy protected her. But in 1609, Elizabeth made a fatal mistake. She began accepting daughters of the lesser nobility into her household, girls sent by their families to learn court manners and make aristocratic connections. When these girls began dying or disappearing, their families had the social standing to demand investigations. And unlike peasant families, noble families had access to the king. King Matthias II received complaints from multiple noble families. He ordered György Thurzo, who was both Palatine of Hungary and Elizabeth's cousin, to investigate. Thurzo was in an impossible position, investigating his own relative, one of the wealthiest women in the kingdom, whose family controlled vast territories and had significant political power. But the king had ordered it, and the complaints were too numerous and specific to ignore. Thurzo spent months collecting testimony from witnesses in the region surrounding Choctice Castle. He interviewed over 300 people: servants, villagers, survivors, local officials. The testimonies were consistent and devastating. Witnesses described seeing bodies carried out of the castle at night. They described hearing screaming. They named specific victims who'd entered the castle and never left. Some witnesses were survivors, girls who'd been beaten but managed to escape. Others were servants who'd assisted in disposing of bodies, burying them in the castle courtyard, in local church cemeteries at night, or throwing them in the river. One witness, a servant named Susanna, testified that she'd seen a book or registry kept by Elizabeth's court official, Jacob Silvasi, that listed 650 names. Silvasi never testified, and the book was never found. But the number, 650 victims, entered the historical record and has haunted Elizabeth's legend ever since. On December 30th, 1610, Thurzo led the raid on Choctice Castle. The evidence was overwhelming. Bodies in various stages of decomposition were found throughout the castle and grounds. Dying and tortured girls were found in the upper chambers. Instruments of torture, iron maidens, cages, chains, sharp implements, were discovered. Elizabeth's 4 primary accomplices were arrested immediately. Elizabeth herself was placed under house arrest in her own castle. She was not imprisoned in a dungeon like a common criminal because of her noble status. Instead, she was confined to a set of rooms in Choctice Castle, the windows and doors walled up with bricks, leaving only small openings for food and air. The trial of Elizabeth's accomplices began in January 1611 in Bitcha, presided over by 20 judges. The 4 servants were charged with witchcraft and mass murder. They were tortured during interrogation, which makes their confessions legally unreliable by modern standards, but their testimonies were remarkably consistent. Dorothea Sentes admitted to killing 36 victims. Ilona Jo admitted to 51. Janos Ujvari admitted to 37. Katalin Benecki, the oldest accomplice, claimed she'd only helped procure victims and hadn't participated in killing. The testimonies described Elizabeth as the primary torturer, with the servants assisting or disposing of bodies. The judges found all 4 accomplices guilty. Their sentences reflected the brutality of the era. Dorothea Sentes and Ilona Jo had their fingers torn out with red-hot pincers, the same implements they'd used on victims, then were thrown alive into a fire and burned to death. Janos Ujvari, because he was considered less culpable due to his youth, was beheaded before his body was burned. Katalin Benetsky, the oldest accomplice, received a life sentence but died in prison shortly after. The executions were public, attended by crowds who'd come to see justice for the murdered girls. Elizabeth Bathory was never formally tried. As a noblewoman of her rank, she could only be tried by a court of her peers, and King Matthias was reluctant to create a spectacle that might destabilize the kingdom or offend the powerful Bathory family. Instead, she was convicted in absentia based on the testimony against her and sentenced to life imprisonment in her own castle. On the day her accomplices were executed, masons began bricking up the windows and doors of Elizabeth's chambers, leaving only small openings for food delivery and waste removal. She remained in those rooms for the next 3.5 years, completely isolated from the outside world. Elizabeth died on August 21st, 1614, at age 54. A guard discovered her body lying face down on the floor of her sealed chambers. The official cause of death was not recorded. She was initially buried in the church at Chaktiche, but local residents objected to having a mass murderer buried in consecrated ground. Her body was moved to the Bathory family crypt at Nir Bator. The exact location of her remains is now unknown, and the family crypt has never been excavated. Some legends claim her body was moved multiple times to prevent grave robbers or those seeking to desecrate her tomb. The question that has haunted historians for over 4 centuries is, how many did she actually kill? The number 650, mentioned by a servant who claimed to have seen it written in a book, has never been verified. The book doesn't exist in any archive. The judges at the trial charged Elizabeth with 80 murders based on the testimony they found most credible. Modern historians estimate the real number is somewhere between 30 and 300, depending on which testimonies are considered reliable. Bodies were found. That's not disputed. Dozens of corpses were recovered from the castle and grounds. Hundreds of witnesses testified to seeing or hearing evidence of murder. But the exact number remains unknowable. There's also significant historical debate about whether Elizabeth was truly guilty of all the crimes attributed to her, or whether she was the victim of a politically motivated frame-up. Several factors support the conspiracy theory. First, Elizabeth was extremely wealthy, controlling vast estates that her family and the king had financial interest in. King Matthias owed Elizabeth a substantial debt, money her deceased husband had lent the crown for military campaigns, that was conveniently cancelled after her imprisonment. Second, Elizabeth had supported her nephew Gabor Bathory, Prince of Transylvania, who was in conflict with the Habsburg monarchy that controlled Hungary. Her wealth and political influence made her a threat. Third, Elizabeth was never given a trial where she could defend herself, which was highly unusual even for the era. The case was handled quickly, with her accomplices tortured into confessions and executed within months. Fourth, many of the witness testimonies were hearsay, servants repeating rumors they'd heard, villagers describing things they'd been told about rather than witnessed directly. Modern analysis of the trial documents shows that of 289 witness accounts, over 250 offered either second-hand information or no substantive testimony at all. Fifth, accusations of witchcraft, sexual deviance, and murder were commonly used in the 16th and 17th centuries to destroy powerful women and confiscate their property. However, the conspiracy theory has significant weaknesses. Physical evidence was found: bodies, torture implements, dying victims. Multiple survivors testified to being tortured by Elizabeth personally. In 1602, 8 years before her arrest, a Lutheran minister named István Magyari wrote a letter complaining about the excessive cruelty exhibited by Elizabeth and her husband toward their servants, demonstrating that concerns about her behavior predated any political motivation to remove her. The consistency of the testimonies, even accounting for torture and coaching, suggests at least some truth to the accusations. and the sheer number of witnesses, over 300, makes a complete fabrication difficult to maintain. The most likely truth is somewhere in between. Elizabeth Bathory was probably not innocent. She lived in a culture where beating servants was normalized, and she had demonstrated cruelty from an early age. She probably did torture and kill servants, taking aristocratic privilege to a murderous extreme. But the number of victims was likely exaggerated, perhaps deliberately, to justify seizing her wealth and eliminating her political influence. The legend of bloodbaths was definitely added later, transforming a sadistic noblewoman into a supernatural monster. The truth, systematic torture and murder of vulnerable young women by someone with absolute power and no accountability, is horrifying enough without embellishment. The impact of Elizabeth Bathory's crimes extended far beyond her own death. Her case became a cautionary tale about unchecked power, about what happens when wealth and status place someone above the law. It influenced European folklore and literature for centuries. The legend of the Blood Countess inspired vampire mythology, Gothic literature, and countless retellings in books, films, and plays. She became a symbol of female evil, of vanity taken to murderous extremes, of aristocratic decadence and moral corruption. But these artistic interpretations often obscured the real victims, the peasant girls whose names were never recorded, whose families were never compensated, whose lives were considered worthless by the society they lived in. The known victims whose names appear in trial testimony deserve to be remembered. Girls like Dorota Sentes, Ilona Joe's daughter, who testified that her mother had forced her to help dispose of bodies. Girls like Pola, Modruha, and Zuzana, whose names appear in witness accounts, but whose stories were never fully told. The daughters of local families who entered Choctice Castle hoping for opportunity and found only suffering. These were real people, not characters in a Gothic legend. They had families, hopes, futures that were stolen from them by someone who believed their lives had no value. Choctice Castle still stands in modern-day Slovakia, though it's a ruin now. Tourists visit to hear the legend of the Blood Countess, to walk the halls where Elizabeth lived and died, to see the courtyard where bodies were supposedly buried. The castle has become a dark tourism destination, with local museums displaying wax figures of Elizabeth and her victims, selling books and souvenirs about the Blood Countess legend. Some residents of the town embrace the historical infamy as a source of tourism revenue. Others resent the sensationalization of mass murder, the way Elizabeth's story has been turned into entertainment rather than tragedy. The fundamental questions raised by Elizabeth Bathory's case remain relevant today. How do societies prevent those with power from abusing those without? What happens when wealth and status place people above accountability? How do we distinguish between genuine historical atrocities and politically motivated accusations? The case offers no simple answers. Elizabeth Bathory was probably a sadistic killer who tortured and murdered vulnerable young women because she could, because her society gave her absolute power over their lives, because she was never held accountable until she made the mistake of targeting victims whose families had the power to fight back. Whether she killed 30 women or 600, the number matters less than what her case reveals about power, privilege, and the disposability of the powerless. The peasant girls who disappeared into Choctice Castle weren't considered important enough to investigate for years. Their families' complaints were dismissed. Only when noble families' daughters started dying did the authorities act. That selective justice, that devaluation of certain lives based on birth and status, enabled Elizabeth's crimes. And versions of that same social hierarchy exist today, in systems where the wealthy escape consequences for actions that would destroy the poor, where some lives are valued more than others, where power still too often means the freedom to harm without accountability. Elizabeth Bathory died in isolation, sealed in her own castle, probably believing until the end that she'd done nothing wrong, that she'd simply exercised the privileges her birth entitled her to. The girls she tortured and killed, the ones whose names we know and the hundreds whose names are lost to history, didn't have the privilege of dying peacefully at age 54. They died young, in terror and agony, their lives reduced to entries in a legendary book that may never have existed. That's the real horror of the Blood Countess case. Not the sensational legend of bathing in blood for eternal youth, but the documented reality of what powerful people can do to the powerless when society looks away.